Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pied Piper of Pasadena Part 11. This is the story of Dean Corll. When we last left off, we had talked about the very brutal murder of not only Gregory Winkle, but David Hellegeist. And the parents of both children had began looking for them very, very fervently. And the police were not going to be any help, so they would even take matters in their own hands, even hiring a private investigator, putting the families even further into debt. And the parents would even put up their phone numbers to receive anonymous tips, even getting one potential tip that they had seen Gregory Winkle befriending a man in his 20s or 30s, and that he could be seen driving a Plymouth GTX in the area around the time that the boys went missing. And not only driving that car, but also a windowless white van. They even wrote down the license plate numbers and brought it to the police attention, thinking that this could be a very good tip. The police would pass it off as a bogus tip, but it was completely the opposite. Because if the police had actually took the time to investigate this tip, they would find out that these vehicles belonged to Dean Corll. And not only did he know where the boys were, he was the person that murdered and buried these children. After the murder of David Hellegeist and Gregory Winkle, Dean Corll would yet move again. And this time he would move to an apartment in St. Filippo Street. And just a little side note about this apartment, once again, the landlord would receive a lot of complaints for loud music. And he would go to check it out. And not only would he find that there would be loud music, but he also had noticed that there was a lot of strange people congregating within the apartment. More than anything, David Brooks would always be at the center whenever there was a large group of people around this apartment. And not only was David Brooks there, but the landlord would also say that a lot of the congregated teenagers that would be coming and going inside the apartment were very straggly, very long hair, and more or less kind of resembled the whole hippie movement that was going on in the 70s. But Dean Corll was completely opposite. The landlord would say that he was very clean cut, very polite, very mild mannered, and the landlord would come to Dean Corll about complaints of the loud music, he would very politely apologize and say that he would try to keep the music down. Reuben Haney would probably be a really good example of the type of children that would be seen congregating within the apartment. He was what you would call a problem child. He was often getting into fights or getting in trouble within school or within the law, to the point that Reuben's mother would often get a lot of phone calls. So in order to keep him out of trouble, Reuben's mother would have him make frequent phone calls if he went out of town or if he was hanging out with some friends, just to kind of keep a tight leash on Reuben and more or less to keep tabs on Reuben to prevent him from getting into any more trouble. Keep also in mind that Reuben at this time is 17 years old. And it should also be known that Reuben was also a friend of David Brooks. And Reuben was also one of the many kids that used to play pool in the Coral Candy Factory when Dean Corll was running it. Now on August 17th, 1971, Reuben would make a phone call to his mother and tell her that he was interested in going to the cinema and seeing the movie The Omega Man starring Charlton Heston. Reuben would then request that she send him extra money so that he could phone call her when he was ready to come home. And Reuben's mother would give him the extra money and he would begin walking over to the cinema and watching the film. Now, after the film had finished and Reuben was on his way to the payphone to call his mother, he would actually run into David Brooks. And David Brooks had informed him that he was getting ready to have a party at the Dean Quarles apartment. And Ruben would turn around and just be like, the Candyman? Because Ruben, as I said before, was one of the many kids that used to play pool in his factory and had knew him as the Candyman, the very nice gentleman that would hand out different candies and give rides on his motorbikes and take trips on the beach. And so Ruben would be interested in going to this party, so he would follow David Brooks to Dean Quarles' apartment. Ruben would actually call his mother around 11:30 at night that night, fairly intoxicated, and would tell his mother that he would be staying at David Brooks's place. His mother would say okay and hang up the phone. After that phone call, Dean Quarles would take a nylon cord and strangle Ruben. And as before strangling Ruben, would torture and sodomize him. And he would be buried once again in Dean Quarles' boat shed. When his mother would go to report Ruben missing after not contacting her within a few days, she would go to the police and would tell the police that the last known whereabouts that her son had been was at a friend's house named David Brooks. The police would not call David Brooks, nor would they investigate it, because Ruben Haney was probably a runaway. End of story. The next two victims that Dean Quarles would take, we don't really know much of, mainly because they're taken by the complete accounts of David Brooks. And the thing that really kind of makes it questionable is because David Brooks could neither remember the names of these victims, nor could he remember the place of where they were buried, which kind of makes you question if it's any facts to these stories, because David Brooks could remember not just the names of the victims, but exactly where they were buried. So that's another reason why I kind of have my doubts when it comes to these next two. But according to David Brooks, there would be one unnamed victim that him and Dean Quarles would torture for 4 days before killing and burying somewhere on Highland Beach. And there would be another victim that David Brooks would say that reminded them both of Jake Glass, if you remember from previous videos. And one thing that could be said was it really hurt Dean to have to kill this kid because of the kid resembling so much of a previous victim. But like I said, I don't know if it's any facts. It's done completely by the testament of David Brooks. And as I said before, we don't even know who their names were or where they were buried. So that's why I didn't really want to continue the stories about those two. Now, if you remember back in the last video where we had talked about David Hellegeist and Gregory Winkle, we had briefly talked about how their friend Elmer Wayne Henley would try to help the parents find the bodies. And in the winter of 1971, Henley would actually be approached by David Brooks to come to Dean Quarles' apartment. Now, one thing about Henley was he was a very smart child with an IQ of 102, and he would have really good grades, but around the time he was 15, his mother would have him drop out of high school to help with the bills around the house. And it's very strange that he would be invited to this apartment because he would be basically one of the few people that would go into that apartment without being killed. And it is said that Brooks had brought Henley there in a plan to be the next victim, but Dean Quarles would just take a liking to Elmer Wayne Henley and would then begin grooming him.